Okay, now that we've got the basics down, let's do some problems here where we try these out. So let's go back to this. Direct material variances. Again, we'll have the direct material cost variance, and we'll have the direct material efficiency variance. Cost variances are actual cost times the actual quantity. Oops. Sorry about that. Minus the standard cost times the actual quantity. So what I really paid minus what I should have paid for this amount of material or whatever I'm buying. Or again, I can rewrite that to be the actual cost minus the standard cost times the actual quantity. In each one of these, I need to hold one thing steady and see the change in the other. So in this one, I'm holding everything at the actual quantity that I should have used, and I'm comparing what I actually paid versus what I thought I was going to pay. So the actual price per pound minus what I was planning per pound, so the difference in what I paid times the actual quantity. For the efficiency variance, again, it's standard quantity or standard cost times actual quantity minus standard cost times standard quantity. So I'm looking at, in this one I'm looking at the difference in the cost. So difference in cost. And here, this is the efficiency. So I'm looking at difference in the usage. So I take them both at the standard cost, but I look at the difference between the actual quantity I used and the standard quantity, what I thought I should have used for this, and I take those both times the standard cost. Okay, so let's look at one of those. Martin Inc. Manufactures lead crystal glasses. The standard direct material quantity is 1 pound per glass and 50 cents per glass. The actual result for 1 month's production of 6,500 glasses was 1.2 pounds per glass and 30 cents per pound. Calculate the direct material cost variance and the direct material efficiency variance. So direct material cost variance will be the difference between what I actually paid and what I thought I was going to pay, and I'll take that times the actual quantity. So I actually paid 30 cents per pound. The standard is 50 cents per pound. So right here I can see that I paid 20 cents less per pound than I thought I was going to. And then I take that times the actual quantity I used. I don't really need to write that twice. And the actual quantity that I used would be, I made 6,500 glasses and I used 1.2 pounds per glass. That's right here. So I actually used 7,800 pounds of glass, and I paid 20 cents less than I thought I was going to. And so that comes out to be $15.60 favorable. The cost was lower than I expected, and so this is a favorable variance of $15.60. For the direct material efficiency variance, again, it's the actual quantity minus, I don't know why that does that, the actual quantity I used minus the standard quantity, how much I thought I should have used for this volume, times the standard cost. So the actual quantity used, I just figured out right here, was 7,800. That is 6,500 glasses times 1.2 pounds per glass. The standard quantity for 6,500 glasses is 1 pound. That's next. So I used 7,800 pounds, but I should have only used 6,500. I take that times the standard cost, which is 50 cents, and I get a $650 unfavorable variance. So I got the glass cheaper than I thought, but I used more of it. So it could be that because I bought cheaper glass, it had more defects in it. It could be I had a lot of new employees that made a lot of mistakes and had to start over, but for some reason I used 1,300 more pounds of glass than I thought I should have needed to make 6,500 glasses. That's what that one tells you. All right, labor variances. Direct labor cost variance. And again, the cost variance will be the actual quantity times the actual cost times the actual quantity minus standard cost times actual quantity. Or we can rewrite that, the actual cost minus the standard cost times the actual quantity. Direct labor efficiency variance. Again, standard cost times actual quantity minus standard cost times standard quantity. Or we can rewrite that, the actual quantity I used minus the standard quantity, what I thought I should have used, times the standard cost. So those are my two labor variances. So we take the same company here. The standard direct labor time is half an hour per glass at $18 per hour is what I pay them. The actual results for the 6,500 glasses were 0.2 hours per glass at a cost of $11 per hour. So I will take, for the direct labor cost variance, the actual cost minus the standard cost times the actual quantity, which in this case will be hours. So I actually paid $11 per hour. I was expecting to pay $18 an hour. So I have $7 less per hour times the actual quantity of hours. And that's right here, 6,500 glasses times 0.2 hours per glass. So I actually used 1,300 hours. So that's $7 an hour times 1,300 hours gives me a $9,100 variance. And it's favorable because I paid less than I was expecting to pay per hour. For the direct labor efficiency variance, I've got the actual quantity minus the standard quantity times the standard cost. So I just said the actual quantity was 1,300 hours, right? Which is the 6,500 glasses times 0.2 minus the standard, which is 6,500 glasses times 0.5 hours per glass. So I was expecting to use 30 to 50 hours. I only used 1,300. And then I take that times the standard cost, which is $18, and I get a $35,000 100 variance. But it's favorable because I used a lot less hours than I was expecting to use. So normally, if you pay less per hour, you end up using more because you've got less skilled labor. So I'm not quite sure how they were able to pull this off. They paid them less and they were more efficient. So you have two favorable variances there. Again, if I just look at direct labor being higher or lower than what I want, I could have big variances either way. And I wouldn't see it if I just lumped them all together. So that's why I need to kind of split those out. Let's look at the overhead variances now, and we'll have variable and fixed overhead. So the overhead variance is the difference between the actual and the allocated. And so the allocated number is based on actual production. So in order to do this one, you come up with a predetermined overhead rate. It's very much like the predetermined overhead rate that we looked at earlier, except it's an allocation rate. And again, it'll just be how much I was expecting this cost to be divided by whatever that cost driver is. And so I take that predetermined overhead rate times the actual production. And so, and then I compare that to what I thought it was going to be. So variable overhead looks a lot like direct labor and direct materials. So the variable overhead cost variance is the difference in the price times the actual quantity. So again, sometimes in this one, the way they give it to you, you'll actually use the long formula, which will be the actual cost times the actual quantity. So what I actually paid minus the standard cost times the actual quantity. So sometimes they just give you, here's what the total variable overhead cost was, which is this guy. But if that's not how they give it, then you can use the one that looks just like the material and the labor, which is actual cost minus standard cost times the actual quantity. And then you've got your variable overhead efficiency variance. Which again will look just like, so standard cost times actual quantity minus standard cost times standard quantity for this level of production, or the actual quantity minus the standard quantity times the standard cost, which is probably more what you'll see. Fixed overhead will be a little bit different. So material, labor, and variable overhead all look the same. Fixed overhead will be a little bit different. In order to do this one, you'll need the actual fixed overhead costs incurred. So the actual, you'll need the budgeted, and you'll need the allocated. So, and we talked about the allocated right here. So for fixed overhead, you have two. You have the fixed overhead cost variance. This is my favorite. Of the 8 variances we calculate, this is my favorite, because you just take the actual fixed overhead minus the budgeted fixed overhead. Both of those numbers are given to you, so that's all you do is you subtract them and you're done. The fixed overhead volume variance, though, is the budgeted fixed overhead minus the allocated, and the allocated will be standard quantity and standard cost. So standard. So that one's generally just a little bit more work for us to get. Okay, so for this one, the first thing we're going to do is come up with the allocation rates, or those predetermined rates, based on the information that we're anticipating at the beginning. So in this case, they said that they allocated based on standard direct labor hours. So the allocation base is direct labor hours, okay? So the variable overhead allocation rate is going to be the budgeted variable overhead divided by the budgeted allocation base, which in this case is direct labor hours. So they are anticipating 7,800 in variable overhead as a total, and they're anticipating 1,300 direct labor hours. So that gives us a rate of $6 per direct labor hour is the allocation rate for variable overhead. And then for fixed overhead allocation rate, same thing. So this will be budgeted fixed overhead over the budgeted base, whatever it is. Some people use machine hours, some people use direct labor dollars. In this case, it's direct labor hours. So I'm anticipating 3,900 in fixed overhead. I'm going to allocate that over 1,300 hours, so I get a rate of $3 per direct labor hour. So I'm going to need some of these numbers on the next problem, so I might have to flip back and forth here a little bit. Okay, so we're going to calculate all 4 of the overhead variances in this one, all right? So variable overhead cost variance is the actual cost times the actual quantity, so the actual variable overhead total minus the standard cost times the actual quantity. So they told me up here, the total variable overhead, the actual total variable overhead was 10,800. So I'm going to leave that like that. The standard cost, if we look back on this one, is $6. That's the standard, is the allocation rate. So that's $6 times the actual quantity that I used, which is, let's see, where did they give me that one? I've got 1,400 hours here. Oh, that's right here. So that is 7,000 units times 0.2. I actually used 1,400 direct labor hours. So that comes out to 8,400 is what I would have allocated. The actual was 10,800. So I've got a 2,400 unfavorable variance. The actual was higher than the standard. The variable overhead efficiency variance is the actual quantity minus the standard quantity times the standard cost. And the standard in this cost, standard equals that allocation rate. So the actual quantity, again, is 1,400, which is the 7,000 units I made times 0.2 hours per unit. .2. The standard quantity would be the 7,000 units I made, and the standard is 0.25. So 7,000 times 0.25 is 1,750. So I used 1,400 hours. I was expecting to use 1,750 to make this many. And so I take that difference times, so that difference right there, times the standard, which is 6, which again is what we calculated right here. And that gives me 2,100, and that's a favorable variance because I used less direct labor hours than I thought I would have. The fixed overhead cost variance, I'm going to put that one up here because that's fairly short. Fixed overhead cost variance is just the difference between the actual fixed overhead and the budgeted fixed overhead. The actual fixed overhead, they told me, is 2,770. So 2,770, and the budgeted was 3,900. That was what they gave me in the first part of the problem. Minus 3,900 gives me 1,130. That's a favorable variance right there. So that's my fixed overhead cost variance. Again, those two numbers are always given to you, so that's why that one's my favorite. I don't have to calculate anything. And then the last one is the fixed overhead volume variance. So this will be the budgeted fixed overhead, which again is that 3,900 that was given in this part of the problem right here, minus the allocated, which is standard at standard. So the standard quantity, standard cost times the standard quantity, okay? So the standard cost is what we figured out right here. That's the $3. That's the allocation rate for the fixed overhead. So that's my standard is 3. And then the standard quantity, I figured that one out right here, right? So that's 1,750, which is 7,000 units, and the standard is 0.25 per unit. So that's 1,750. So 3,900 minus, this comes out to 5,250 is what I allocated, and so the difference is 1,350, and that is, I think that comes out as favorable, but the budgeted minus the allocated, I allocated more to the jobs than I budgeted, so I would have had that covered. It doesn't necessarily mean that's good. That means you added more into your jobs than you probably should have. The last thing, and I'm not going to go through all these, but all these things then require journal entries, because what these ultimately mean is that, so you put everything in to work in process at standard, okay? And so you put everything in at standard. So labor, materials, all that, you put it in at standard. So, and that's what the journal entries kind of walk you through. So, when I buy raw materials, it'll be the actual quantity times the standard cost, not what I actually paid for it. And then that's the number that goes from raw material into work in process into cost of goods sold. Labor goes in the standard quantity at the standard cost. And then that's what, again, transfers into work in process. And so the same thing with what you allocated overhead at standard. And so that means if there's variances, the amount that you put into raw materials or direct labor and then into work in process and then into cost of goods sold is either too high or too low based on what you actually paid. So at the end of this, you have to record these variances and you have to end up adjusting cost of goods sold. And so that's what the journal entries are that kind of walk you through that. And so those are in the book. I think you can kind of follow along. Remember, it goes in at standard, and then you can go back later and correct for the variances, and then you have to kind of adjust your actual cost based on those standards. So to make sure you've got the right number going forward. Again, we want to follow these standards. We want to figure out what's causing them. Sometimes there's nothing you can do. If your landlord raised your rent, you weren't expecting it, that's not anything you can do. Or if your insurance went up, so that's going to throw your things off from what you budgeted, but you can know that for going forward. However, if people are becoming less efficient, or if some of your materials costs are sliding up or that kind of stuff, those are the types of things you want to make sure that you are aware of. So that is chapter 23.